What if the moment you have been waiting for is not the moment they come back, but the moment you finally stop believing that their distance was caused by something wrong with you? What if the silence, the withdrawal, the sudden change in energy, and the emotional walls were never proof that you were too much, too needy, too emotional, or not enough? What if you were carrying a burden that never belonged to you in the first place? There is a painful question many people ask themselves after loving someone with avoidant tendencies. What did I do wrong? You replay conversations. You analyze your messages. You remember the moments when you asked for reassurance. You wonder if you moved too fast, if you cared too deeply, if you expected too much, if you said the wrong thing at the wrong time, and slowly, without even realizing it, you begin turning their distance into evidence against yourself. But listen carefully. Distance is not always rejection. Silence is not always proof of your unworthiness. And someone's inability to handle emotional closeness does not automatically mean you failed to love them correctly. Avoidance can function as a way of managing emotional stress by disengaging from what feels threatening or overwhelming. This is where your healing begins. Because the most powerful shift happens when you stop asking, how can I become better so they will stay? And start asking, why did I ever believe I had to become someone else to be loved? That question changes everything. An avoidant person may appear confident when they pull away. They may act like they do not care. They may become colder exactly when you become more emotionally open. They may convince themselves that they simply need freedom, space, or independence. But emotional distancing can also become a protective response. Some people learn to protect themselves by reducing closeness, suppressing emotion, or becoming extremely self-reliant. In adult attachment theory, avoidance of intimacy is closely connected with reluctance or fear around emotional closeness, and this is why you cannot measure your value by their ability to receive love. You may have offered patience, you may have communicated honestly, you may have given them room, you may have tried to understand what they could not explain, you may have lowered your expectations just to keep the connection alive, you may have stayed quiet when your heart wanted answers because you were afraid that asking for more would push them away. But eventually, something inside you becomes exhausted. You realize that you have been working harder to maintain the relationship than the relationship has been working to maintain you. That realization hurts, but it can also set you free, because there comes a moment when the avoidant may begin to see the situation differently. Not necessarily because you convinced them, not because you chased them, not because you finally found the perfect words, but because distance creates space for reflection. When the emotional pressure disappears, they may finally have room to notice what their own behavior created. They may remember how consistently you showed up. They may remember the conversations they avoided. They may remember the affection they pushed away. They may remember the moments when you were asking for connection while they were protecting themselves from it, and suddenly a different thought can appear. Maybe it wasn't them. Maybe I was the one pulling away. Maybe they were not asking for too much. Maybe they were simply asking me to meet them emotionally. That realization can be uncomfortable because it forces a person to look at themselves without the protection of blame. And that is the part you need to understand. You cannot force someone into self-awareness. You cannot make someone confront their patterns. You cannot love someone so perfectly that they automatically become emotionally available. Their growth has to become their responsibility. Your responsibility is different. Your responsibility is to stop abandoning yourself while waiting for someone else to stop abandoning you. You do not need to prove that you were good enough. You do not need to build a courtroom inside your mind and defend every decision you made. You do not need to keep collecting evidence that you deserved love. You already did. Maybe you made mistakes. Of course you did. You are human. Maybe you became anxious. Maybe you reacted emotionally. Maybe you asked the same question too many times because you were desperate for clarity. But your imperfect reactions do not automatically explain another person's lifelong emotional patterns. Do not confuse your response to emotional uncertainty with the cause of that uncertainty. That distinction can change your entire life, because once you understand it, you stop chasing closure from someone who may not know how to give it. You stop treating their withdrawal as a verdict. You stop measuring your worth according to how close they are willing to stand, and you begin returning to yourself. The deepest victory is not making an avoidant realize your value. The deepest victory is realizing your value before they do. Because maybe one day they will look back and understand that you were not the problem. Maybe they will recognize that you were asking for something simple: honesty, consistency, emotional presence, and a relationship where you did not have to constantly wonder where you stood. But by that time, something inside you may already be different. You may no longer need their realization to validate your truth. And if you stay until the end of this message, you will discover the deeper turning point that can happen when an avoidant finally loses the emotional distance that once protected them. More importantly, you will understand how to stop carrying their emotional patterns as if they were your personal failure. Because the day you stop blaming yourself for someone else's inability to connect is the day you begin taking your power back. And sometimes that is where the real healing begins. But what happens when the silence finally becomes quiet enough for a person to hear their own thoughts? What happens when there is no longer a relationship crisis demanding an immediate reaction, no emotional conversation to escape, and no one standing in front of them asking for an explanation? Sometimes that is when the mind begins telling a different story. When closeness feels threatening, people with stronger attachment avoidance can rely on emotional suppression, distancing, and self-reliance to reduce uncomfortable feelings. Research on attachment has repeatedly connected avoidance with these deactivating strategies. The important part is this. These reactions can protect someone from emotional discomfort in the short term, while creating distance in the relationship over time. And after the relationship becomes quiet, that protection may no longer feel as powerful. The person who once convinced themselves that they needed space may begin wondering why the space feels so empty. The person who thought they were simply protecting their independence may begin noticing how much they lost while protecting it. The person who believed the relationship was the problem may eventually recognize something much harder to face. The relationship was not necessarily demanding too much. It may have simply brought them close to feelings they did not know how to handle. That realization does not usually arrive like a dramatic revelation. It can begin with something small, a memory, a familiar message, a place they once shared, a moment when someone cared for them without asking for anything in return. And suddenly, the mind connects things that were easier to keep separate before. They remember the patience you had. They remember the way you tried to understand them. They remember the opportunities you gave them to communicate. They remember moments when you reached for connection and they answered with distance. And now they may see those moments from a different emotional position. Before, your need for closeness may have felt like pressure. Later, it may look like love. Before, your questions may have sounded demanding. Later, they may understand that you were trying to feel secure. Before, your emotional honesty may have seemed overwhelming. Later, they may recognize that you are simply being vulnerable. That shift matters because perception changes when the nervous system is no longer trying to escape the situation. When the immediate feeling of threat decreases, a person may have more room to reflect on what actually happened. Avoidance strategies are designed partly to reduce attachment-related distress by pushing emotional material out of awareness or minimizing its importance. But what gets pushed away does not necessarily disappear. Sometimes it waits. And when the distractions become weaker, the memories become louder. This is why you should never assume that someone's calm behavior means they felt nothing. A person can look unaffected while privately struggling with emotions they have learned to suppress. That does not mean every distant person secretly wants you back. It does not mean every avoidant will eventually return. And it certainly does not mean you should put your life on hold, waiting for a realization that may never come. It means something much more important. You cannot always see what another person is processing. So stop using their visible reaction as a measurement of your worth. This is where many people lose themselves. They see someone walking away and immediately conclude, I must not have mattered. No, someone walking away tells you what they chose to do. It does not tell you what you are worth. Those are two completely different things. Maybe you loved more openly than they could tolerate. Maybe you communicated needs they were not prepared to meet. Maybe emotional intimacy activated defenses they had spent years developing. Research has found that people higher in attachment avoidance tend to rely more on suppression and less on interpersonal emotional support, particularly when closeness or relationship stress is involved. But their defense is not your identity. Their discomfort is not your inadequacy. Their withdrawal is not your verdict. You have to become very careful with the story you tell yourself after someone pulls away. The human mind hates uncertainty. When something painful does not make sense, it searches for an explanation. And because you know your own behavior better than anyone else, your mind may begin investigating you. What if I had been calmer? What if I had given more space? What if I had not asked for commitment? What if I had acted less emotional? What if I had been easier to love? But notice what is happening. You are turning yourself into a problem that needs to be solved. You are treating love like a test you failed. You are assuming that if you become perfect enough, someone else's defenses will disappear. That is not healing, that is self-abandonment. You can learn from your mistakes without becoming ashamed of your existence. You can recognize unhealthy reactions without accepting responsibility for another person's emotional limitations. You can become more secure without becoming smaller. That is the strength you need now. Because the moment an avoidant begins to recognize that it was not your fault, may also be the moment you recognize that you were never supposed to carry all the responsibility. Maybe they finally understand that you were not trying to control them, you were trying to connect. Maybe they understand that you were not demanding constant attention, you were asking for consistency. Maybe they understand that you were not trying to take away their freedom, you were asking to feel safe inside the relationship. And perhaps the hardest realization for them is this. You may have been responding to the very distance they created. When someone repeatedly becomes unavailable, the other person often reacts to that uncertainty. They may ask more questions, they may seek reassurance, they may become more alert to changes in tone or behavior. The relationship can become a cycle where one person's withdrawal increases the other's need for clarity, which then makes the first person retreat even further. But a cycle is not the same thing as a single person's fault. And once you understand that, you stop fighting yourself. You stop rewriting every conversation. You stop wishing you had been less human. You stop believing that the right combination of silence, patience, beauty, success, or emotional control would have guaranteed a different outcome. You begin seeing the relationship with clearer eyes, not through desperation, not through fantasy, not through self-blame, through truth. And truth can hurt at first because it removes the illusion that you could have controlled everything. But that same truth becomes freedom when you realize that you were never responsible for controlling another person's readiness for intimacy. Your job was to show up honestly. Their job was to decide whether they could meet you there. That distinction gives you your strength back. Because love should invite you to become more fully yourself, not train you to constantly monitor yourself so someone else will remain comfortable. And when you finally understand that, you stop waiting for their realization to rescue you. You become the person who rescues yourself. You stop asking, how do I make them understand what they lost? And you start asking, what will I never again sacrifice just to keep someone close? That question is powerful. Because the answer becomes the boundary that protects the new version of you. And once you reach that point, something deeper begins to change. You are no longer trying to decode every reaction, predict every mood, or find the hidden meaning behind every quiet moment. You begin to understand that another person's emotional world is not a puzzle you were assigned to solve. You can care about what they feel without making their feelings your responsibility. You can understand their struggles without becoming responsible for healing them. This is where the story becomes bigger than the relationship itself. Because sometimes the person who walked away eventually has to sit with the truth they avoided while you were together. They may realize that you are not asking them to become someone completely different. You are asking them to participate. You are asking them to communicate. You are asking for a bond where both people could remain present when emotions became uncomfortable. And that can create a painful realization. They may remember how easy it was to focus on your reactions instead of their behavior. It was easier to say you were too emotional than to ask why your emotions had become so intense. It was easier to call you demanding than to examine why you felt uncertain. It was easier to describe the relationship as overwhelming than to question why closeness itself felt so difficult. But eventually, responsibility has a way of becoming impossible to avoid. When the noise disappears, a person can no longer keep blaming the circumstances forever. They may begin noticing a pattern. Perhaps it happened before you. Perhaps it happened with someone else. Perhaps the same desire for freedom appeared every time a relationship became serious. Perhaps emotional warmth felt wonderful from a distance, but uncomfortable when it became real. Perhaps they wanted connection until connection required vulnerability. Perhaps they loved the idea of intimacy, but struggled with the reality of being truly known. And then your relationship becomes part of a much larger picture. That can be the moment when the truth becomes impossible to ignore. It was never simply about you. It was about what closeness awakened inside them. This does not make every hurtful action acceptable. Understanding someone's emotional defenses does not erase the impact of their choices. Compassion should never become an excuse for tolerating repeated neglect, confusion, disrespect, or emotional inconsistency. You can understand where a behavior comes from and still decide that behavior is not healthy enough for your life. That distinction is essential, because people sometimes use psychology to keep themselves trapped. They learn about attachment styles. They study emotional defenses. They watch countless explanations about why someone withdraws. They become experts on the other person's wounds while completely forgetting their own needs. They know why the other person is distant. They know why the other person becomes uncomfortable. They know why the other person struggles with vulnerability, but they no longer know what they themselves require from love. Do not make that mistake. Understanding should create freedom, not another reason to wait. If an avoidant eventually recognizes that you were not the cause of their discomfort, that realization belongs to their journey. You do not need to stand outside their emotional door waiting for them to discover it. You do not need to remain available just because one day they might understand. Your life cannot be built around someone else's future awareness. There is a powerful psychological reason why this matters. When people repeatedly search for explanations after rejection or uncertainty, they can become stuck in rumination. The mind keeps returning to the same memories because it believes another round of analysis will finally produce control. But endless analysis often creates more emotional exhaustion instead of resolution. So at some point, you have to close the investigation. Not because you have every answer, because you have enough information to choose yourself. Maybe you will never know exactly what they thought during every silent moment. Maybe you will never know whether they regretted a particular decision. Maybe they will never explain why they suddenly changed. Maybe their realization will happen privately, without a message, apology, or dramatic return. And you have to be okay with that. Because closure does not always arrive as a conversation. Sometimes closure arrives as a decision. A decision to stop questioning your value. A decision to stop shrinking your needs. A decision to stop treating emotional distance as something you must earn your way out of. A decision to stop confusing potential with reality. That is where your strength becomes visible. Imagine the difference between these two lives. In one, you wake up wondering whether they thought about you. You check for signs, you interpret silence, you wait for movement. Your mood changes according to whether they appear closer or farther away. In the other, you wake up knowing that your peace does not depend on another person's emotional availability. Which life gives you your power back? The second one. Not because you stopped caring, because you stopped disappearing inside your care for someone else. And this is the lesson that can remain with you long after the relationship has ended. Someone else's inability to receive love does not make your love worthless. Think about that carefully. A song does not become bad because one person cannot hear its beauty. A book does not lose its meaning because one reader closes it. And your heart does not become less valuable because one person could not handle what you were offering. You are allowed to be loving. You are allowed to want closeness. You are allowed to desire reassurance. You are allowed to expect effort. You are allowed to say that inconsistency hurts. You are allowed to walk away when a relationship repeatedly leaves you questioning whether you matter. Those are not signs that you are weak. They are signs that you have learned what your emotional life requires. And perhaps one day, that person will understand all of this. They may recognize that you were not their enemy. They may see that you were never trying to trap them. They may finally understand that your emotional needs were not an attack on their independence. But whether they understand it tomorrow, next year, or never does not change the truth. You know what you lived. You know how much effort you gave. You know how many times you tried to create understanding. And now you get to decide what happens next. Do not wait for someone else to confirm your reality before you trust it. Do not require an apology before you permit yourself to heal. Do not need their regret before you release the guilt. And do not confuse their eventual awareness with your personal victory. Your victory is becoming so emotionally grounded that their realization becomes information rather than permission to move forward. That is real growth. You stop needing them to say, "You were not the problem." You begin saying it to yourself, "You were not perfect. You did not handle every moment perfectly. But you were human. You loved with the understanding you had at the time. You reacted to what you experienced. You tried to make sense of something that often made no sense. And now you know better. So take the lesson. Leave the blame. Keep the wisdom. Let the experience teach you what mutual effort looks like, what emotional safety feels like, and what you will no longer accept simply because you are afraid of losing someone. The deepest form of healing is not getting the distant person to finally recognize your worth. It is reaching a place where their recognition is no longer required. That is the moment you become free. And when you become free, you no longer have to chase understanding from someone who once struggled to understand themselves. You can walk forward with your head high, not because you won, not because they lost, but because you finally stopped fighting against yourself. And perhaps that is the truth you needed all along. Their distance may have told you something about their capacity, but it never had the authority to define your value.